I remember that morning with the kind of clarity that only comes when your life is about to split in two. The kitchen floor was cold against my bare feet, each step a small shock that traveled up through my bones. I had been standing there for several minutes, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm in my hands, watching the steam dissipate into nothing. The house felt different when Clara wasn't there. Not better or worse, exactly, but hollow in a way that made me aware of every small sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the settling of wood in the walls. She had left early for a conference call, her heels clicking across this same floor in the efficient rhythm that had become the soundtrack of our marriage. Productive, purposeful, everything I no longer felt myself to be. I set the mug down on the counter without taking a sip. The wedding ring on my finger caught the morning light streaming through the window, a brief flash of gold that reminded me of promises made 20 years ago. Back then, I had believed in the weight of that ring, in the certainty it represented. Now it felt like evidence of something I could no longer quite recall believing in. The silence pressed against me from all directions. Marissa had left for school an hour ago, her backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds already blocking out whatever goodbye I might have offered. At 17, she moved through our house like a guest who couldn't wait to check out. I couldn't blame her. There was something suffocating about the careful politeness that had settled over our family, like dust on furniture no one bothered to use anymore. The knock at the door came just as I was contemplating the crack that ran across our kitchen ceiling like a crooked smile. We had been ignoring it for months, Clara and I, the way we ignored most things that required more than surface-level attention. But the leak during last week's storm had forced our hand. Water damage waits for no one, Clara had said, already dialing contractors before the rain had stopped. I padded to the front door, still barefoot, still carrying the weight of another sleepless night. The man on my doorstep was perhaps 10 years younger than me, tool bag in one hand, clipboard in the other. His name was Elias, he said, and he was here about the ceiling. His voice was steady, unremarkable, the kind of voice that should have passed through my awareness without leaving a mark. But as I led him through the house, something about his presence felt different from the parade of repair men who had passed through our doors over the years. Maybe it was the way he moved through our space without the usual mixture of deference and judgment that service workers often carried. He didn't comment on the family photos lining the hallway, didn't ask about the expensive coffee machine that Clara never used, didn't seem to catalog our choices the way strangers usually did. He simply existed in our rooms as though he belonged there. We stood beneath the damaged section of ceiling in what Clara optimistically called the breakfast nook, though we hadn't eaten breakfast together there in years. Elias studied the crack with the kind of attention I hadn't given anything in longer than I could remember. He reached up to trace the damaged plaster with his fingertips, and I found myself watching the careful deliberation of his movements, the way his shirt pulled slightly across his shoulders as he stretched upward. He asked if he could borrow the stepladder from the garage. I brought it to him, my bare feet now numb against the cold floor, and held it steady as he climbed to get a closer look at the damage. From where I stood, I could see the concentration on his face, the small furrow between his eyebrows as he assessed the problem that Clara and I had chosen to live with rather than confront. When he finished his examination and stepped down, he placed his hand on my shoulder to steady himself. It was nothing more than a practical gesture, the kind of brief contact that happens a dozen times a day between strangers. His palm was warm through the thin fabric of my t-shirt, his fingers spread wide enough that I could feel each point of contact. But in that moment, time seemed to slow and thicken around us. The morning light shifted, the sounds of the house faded, and I became hyper-aware of the solid reality of another person's touch in a way I hadn't experienced in longer than I cared to admit. I looked up at him, and for just an instant, our eyes met. There was nothing profound in his expression, no hidden meaning I could decipher later. Just the neutral professionalism of a man doing his job. But something passed between us in that brief glance, or maybe something passed through me, like recognition of a language I had forgotten I once knew. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then his hand was gone, and he was speaking about load-bearing beams and water damage. his voice professional and distant. But something had shifted in that brief moment, some small fracture in the careful architecture of my ordinary life. I stood there nodding at his assessment of our ceiling, agreeing to his timeline for repairs, while beneath the surface, something I had kept buried for decades began to stir, as dangerous and inevitable as the water that had found its way through our defenses and into the hidden spaces of our home. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where people moved to disappear into respectability. Tree-lined streets with names like Maple Grove and Willow Court, houses that differed only in their shutters and mailbox styles, lawns maintained with the quiet desperation of people who had nothing left to prove except that they belonged. Clara and I had chosen this place 15 years ago because it felt safe, predictable. A good place to raise Marissa, we had told ourselves, though I sometimes wondered if we had really chosen it because it was a good place to stop asking difficult questions about who we were supposed to be. The morning routine had calcified over the years into something that resembled choreography more than intimacy. Clara would rise first, her alarm set for 6:15, and move through the house with the efficiency of someone who had eliminated all unnecessary motion from her life. Coffee brewing, shower running, the sound of her blow-dryer creating a wall of white noise that filled the spaces where conversation might have lived. By the time I dragged myself from bed, she would already be dressed for work, scrolling through emails on her phone while eating yogurt she didn't seem to taste. Marissa emerged from her room like a creature surfacing from deep water, earbuds already in place, her entire being radiating the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being 17 and trapped in a life you had no hand in choosing. She accepted the car ride to school with the resigned grace of someone who understood that protest would only prolong the inevitable. Our conversations during these drives had been reduced to the essential. Reminders about pickup times, questions about homework that she answered with monosyllables, the occasional observation about weather that neither of us cared about. I would watch her disappear into the stream of teenagers flowing toward the school entrance, her shoulders set in the same defensive posture I recognized from my own adolescence, and feel the familiar pang of having failed to bridge some essential gap between us. She was becoming someone I didn't know, or maybe someone I knew too well, someone who could see through the careful performance of normalcy that Clara and I had been staging for her benefit all these years. The drive home took me through neighborhoods identical to our own, past houses where other middle-aged men were probably staring out windows, wondering how they had arrived at lives that felt like elaborate costumes they couldn't figure out how to take off. I would park in our driveway and sit for a moment in the car, looking at our house as though I were seeing it for the first time, trying to remember what I had imagined I would feel when I looked at it. Inside, the photographs told the story we had agreed to believe about ourselves. Wedding pictures from 20 years ago, both of us young and certain in ways that seemed almost foreign now. Family vacations to beaches and mountains where we had smiled on command, creating evidence of happiness for some future version of ourselves that we imagined would need proof that we had once been content. Marissa's school pictures progressing through the years, her face gradually losing the openness of childhood and acquiring the careful neutrality she wore now like armor. These images sat on shelves and hung on walls like artifacts from some lost civilization, remnants of people who had once believed in the story they were telling. I found myself studying them sometimes, searching for clues about when exactly we had stopped being the people in those photographs and started being the people who looked at them with the puzzled distance of strangers trying to remember someone else's life. My days blended into each other with the weight of accumulated routine. After dropping Marissa at school, I would drive to the office where I managed accounts for a company that sold something I had stopped trying to explain to people at parties. My name appeared on business cards and email signatures, but I moved through the workplace like a ghost, completing tasks that seemed to have no connection to any larger purpose I could identify. Meetings where people discussed strategies and objectives that felt as abstract as theoretical physics. Phone calls where I heard myself saying words that meant nothing to me, using a voice that belonged to someone I had been pretending to be for so long that I had forgotten it was pretense. The evenings were the hardest part. Clara would return from work with the focused energy of someone who found meaning in what she did. Her conversation filled with names and projects that required my attention in ways I struggled to provide. She would ask about my day, and I would offer the kind of summary that satisfied the requirements of marital communication without revealing the essential emptiness that filled the hours between morning and evening. After dinner, which we ate while Marissa retreated to her room and Clara caught up on emails, I would find myself in the small room I called my study, though I rarely studied anything except the ceiling crack that had been growing wider for months. I would sit in the leather chair that had once represented my idea of masculine sophistication and stare upward at that thin line of damage that seemed to extend a little further each time I looked at it. The crack had started small, barely noticeable, the kind of thing you tell yourself you'll address when you have time. But time had revealed it to be more persistent than either Clara or I had wanted to admit. It ran along the line where the walls met the ceiling, following some hidden weakness in the structure of our house, growing more pronounced with each season of expansion and contraction, heat and cold, the constant pressure of simply existing in a world that wore away at everything given enough time. Sometimes I would stand on my desk chair and trace the crack with my finger, feeling the slight give in the plaster, the sense that something was shifting beneath the surface that we couldn't see. The crack felt like a secret the house was keeping from us, evidence of some fundamental instability that we had been living with without understanding its implications. Clara had mentioned it periodically over the months, adding it to the growing list of repairs that we discussed, but never seemed to prioritize. Like so many things in our life together, it had become something we acknowledged but didn't address, a problem that existed in the space between recognition and action, growing more serious while we continued to believe we had time to deal with it later. But looking at it now, in the quiet of these evening hours when the house settled around us, and I could hear Marissa's music bleeding through her bedroom walls and Clara's fingers tapping on her laptop keyboard, I understood that the crack represented something more than structural damage. It was the visible manifestation of all the small compromises and accumulated silences that had been weakening the foundation of our lives together, threatening something we had built but never quite learned to inhabit. The weight of normalcy pressed down on me in those moments, the suffocating predictability of a life that had been constructed to eliminate surprise, risk, the possibility of change. I had stopped asking myself whether I felt truly alive somewhere in the middle of all these carefully managed years, stopped wondering whether the person I had become bore any resemblance to the person I had once imagined I might be. Above me, the ceiling held its fragile position, supporting the structure of our ordinary days while harboring its own quiet rebellion, its own insistent reminder that nothing built to last actually lasts forever, that everything eventually reaches the point where ignoring the damage becomes more dangerous than facing whatever lies beneath the carefully maintained surface of our lives. The storm that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of weather that seemed to carry personal grievances against the suburban certainties we had built our lives around. Rain came in sheets that overwhelmed our gutters and found every weakness in our defenses, seeping through the crack I had been ignoring for months with the patience of something that had always known this moment would come. I woke to the sound of water dripping into a pot Clara had positioned beneath the worst of the damage, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to count down the moments until we could no longer pretend the problem would resolve itself. She was already dressed for work, phone pressed to her ear, speaking to someone about emergency repairs with the brisk efficiency she brought to every crisis that threatened to disrupt our carefully managed routine. "Water damage waits for no one," she said to me while waiting for the contractor to answer, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone who had been forced to acknowledge a problem she had hoped would disappear through willful ignorance. The ceiling above our breakfast nook had developed a brown stain that spread outward like a map of some country I didn't want to visit, and the plaster was beginning to sag with the weight of absorbed moisture. Elias arrived within the hour, stepping through our front door with the quiet authority of someone who had seen this particular variety of domestic disaster countless times before. He moved through our house differently than he had during his initial assessment, with the focused attention of someone who understood that delay would only make the damage worse. He carried tools this time: a proper ladder, plastic sheeting to protect our furniture from the debris that would inevitably fall when he opened up the ceiling to assess the full extent of what the storm had revealed. I found myself watching him work with an intensity that should have embarrassed me, but instead felt like something essential, as though I were studying a language I needed to learn. The way he measured twice before making any cuts, the careful deliberation with which he peeled back sections of damaged plaster, the quiet competence that seemed to extend from his hands through his entire being. When he spoke, it was to ask practical questions about when the leak had first appeared, whether we had noticed any other signs of water damage, where our insurance papers might be located. But as the morning wore on, our conversation began to drift beyond the immediate crisis. While he worked to expose the full extent of the damage, I found myself offering coffee, then lingering to watch him drink it, noting the way he held the mug with both hands as though warming himself against some cold I couldn't see. He mentioned that he had been doing this kind of work for 8 years, since he had moved here from Portland, leaving behind what he described simply as a situation that hadn't worked out. There was something in the way he said it that made me want to ask more, but I recognized the particular privacy that surrounded certain kinds of endings, the careful distance people maintain when they are still healing from something they don't want to name. Instead, I asked about Portland, and his face brightened slightly as he described the rain there, different from our rain. He said, more persistent but somehow gentler, the kind of weather that became part of your daily experience rather than an interruption to it. When he needed to reach a section of ceiling that was particularly high, he climbed the ladder while I held it steady, my hands gripping the aluminum sides while he worked above me. From this position, I could see the concentration in his face, the small movements of his mouth as he worked through some internal calculation about load-bearing beams and water routes. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better days, soft-looking and faded in a way that suggested it was chosen for comfort rather than appearance. As he descended the ladder, one of his legs brushed against my shoulder, a contact so brief I might have imagined it if not for the way it seemed to echo through my body long after he had stepped away. He apologized automatically, the way people do for minor collisions that mean nothing, but I found myself nodding too quickly, my voice catching slightly as I assured him it was fine, no problem at all. The repair would take several days, he explained, maybe a week, depending on how much of the supporting structure had been compromised by the water. He would need to return tomorrow with more materials, and the day after that to begin the reconstruction once everything had dried properly. As he packed his tools, I realized I was already counting the hours until he would be back, filling our house again with the particular energy of someone who understood how to fix things that seemed irreparably broken. That evening, after Clara had surveyed the damage and made her calls to the insurance company, after Marissa had glanced at the plastic sheeting covering our breakfast nook with the weary resignation of someone whose life had been disrupted by yet another adult crisis she hadn't chosen, I found myself in my study, staring not at the ceiling but at my hands. I could still feel the echo of that brief contact, his leg against my shoulder, the weight and warmth of another person's body intersecting with mine in a space that had felt increasingly empty of meaningful human connection. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, the kind of incidental contact that happens when two people share a small space while trying to accomplish practical tasks. But my body seemed to have its own opinion about what had happened, some part of me responding to that moment with an intensity that felt both unfamiliar and strangely like recognition, as though I were remembering something I had forgotten I once knew. The next morning, I found myself checking my appearance in the bathroom mirror with more attention than I had given it in years, noting the gray that had appeared at my temples, the lines around my eyes that marked the accumulated weight of all these carefully managed days. I told myself I was simply being considerate, presenting myself as a responsible homeowner who took proper care of his property, but the extra attention I gave to my shirt choice, the way I ran my hand through my hair one more time, suggested motivations I wasn't quite ready to examine directly. When Elias returned, He brought with him a sense of purpose that seemed to activate something in our house that had been dormant for longer than I cared to acknowledge. He worked with the focused intensity of someone who found meaning in the act of repair, of taking something damaged and making it whole again. But during breaks, when he would step outside to smoke or check something in his truck, our conversations began to extend beyond the immediate requirements of the job. He asked about the books that lined the shelves in my study, recognizing authors I had assumed no one read anymore, mentioning titles that had meant something to me in college but that I hadn't thought about in years. When he noticed the old vinyl records stacked beside my unused stereo system, he spoke about music with the kind of reverence I remembered feeling myself, before life had taught me to be embarrassed by enthusiasm for things that couldn't be quantified in terms of practical achievement. Each conversation left me feeling slightly unmoored, as though someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed for years, letting in air I had forgotten I needed to breathe. I began to look forward to these moments with an intensity that worried me. This middle-aged man, finding himself affected by the presence of someone who seemed to see possibilities in our damaged house that I had stopped believing existed. There was something unsettling about the way Elias moved through our space, not like the other repair people who had passed through our doors over the years, but like someone who understood that fixing what was broken required more than technical skill. It required the ability to see what had been there before the damage occurred, and the faith that it could exist that way again. Over the following days, I developed what I told myself were helpful habits. I would check on Elias's progress every hour or so, ostensibly to see how the work was advancing, but really to occupy the same space as him, to breathe the same air that held the scent of sawdust and joint compound, and something else I couldn't name, but found myself seeking like a drug I hadn't known I needed. I began to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, appearing with tools he was about to ask for, offering coffee at precisely the moment when I noticed his energy flagging, finding reasons to hold the other end of measuring tape or steady pieces of drywall while he marked cutting lines. These small collaborations felt more intimate than anything I had experienced in years, our hands occasionally brushing as we passed materials between us, our bodies moving around each other in the confined space with a choreography that seemed to develop naturally, without discussion. He accepted my help with the patient grace of someone who understood that my presence served purposes beyond practical assistance. Sometimes I would catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher, something between amusement and curiosity, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle I didn't realize I presented. But he never asked me to leave, never suggested that my hovering might be unnecessary, and I began to interpret his tolerance as something approaching invitation. Our conversations during these shared hours began to drift beyond the surface courtesies that had characterized our early interactions. While he sanded rough edges or measured angles, I found myself asking questions that had nothing to do with the repair work, drawn to learn about the life that had shaped this man who seemed so comfortable with the act of transformation, of taking something broken and making it whole again. He had grown up in small towns, he told me, the son of a carpenter who had taught him that working with your hands was both practical skill and spiritual practice, a way of understanding the world through direct engagement with its materials. After high school, he had drifted through various jobs and relationships, always searching for something he couldn't quite articulate, some combination of purpose and connection that seemed to exist just beyond his reach. There had been someone in Portland, he said during a particularly quiet afternoon when the only sounds were the scrape of his putty knife against the wall and the distant hum of Clara's conference call from her home office. A relationship that had lasted 3 years, someone who had wanted things from him that he couldn't provide, or perhaps had wanted things from life that couldn't accommodate the kind of person he was discovering himself to be. The details emerged slowly, offered in fragments during the natural pauses in his work. A partner who had grown frustrated with his reluctance to plan beyond the immediate future, who had needed certainties and commitments that felt premature to someone still figuring out what he actually wanted from his days on Earth. The ending had been gradual rather than dramatic, a slow recognition of incompatibility that had felt like failure even though both of them had acknowledged it was probably inevitable. Since then, he had been moving from job to job, city to city, carrying his tools and his uncertainty with equal measures of resignation and hope. But lately, he said, he had been thinking about the possibility of staying somewhere long enough to build something more substantial than temporary repairs, to find work that felt less like survival and more like contribution to something larger than his immediate needs. As he spoke, I found myself listening with an intensity that surprised me, hanging on every word as though he were describing not just his own search for meaning, but articulating desires I had never allowed myself to recognize. His voice carried no self-pity, no dramatic emphasis, just the quiet honesty of someone who had learned to live with uncertainty while maintaining hope that clarity might eventually emerge from the accumulation of experience. I began to look forward to these conversations with an anticipation that felt both innocent and dangerous, the way I imagined an alcoholic might anticipate the first drink of the day while still believing he could stop after just one. Each revelation about his life created a corresponding hunger in me to share something of my own experience. But when I tried to reciprocate with stories of my own history, I found myself stumbling over words, uncertain what truths I was ready to acknowledge even to myself. The evening that changed the fundamental architecture of whatever was developing between us came during the second week of repairs, on a night when circumstance had cleared our house of its usual inhabitants. Clara was attending a client dinner that would keep her out until late, and Marissa had been invited to sleep over at a friend's house, leaving me alone with Elias as daylight faded and the workday officially ended, but neither of us moved to conclude our shared occupation of the half-repaired space. He had been working later than usual, trying to finish installing a section of new drywall before the weekend, and I had remained nearby under the pretense of cleaning up debris, both of us extending the day through small delays and unnecessary tasks. The room smelled of fresh plaster and the coffee we had been drinking, and dust motes hung in the air like suspended possibilities, visible in the slanted light coming through the window. When he finally set down his tools and stretched, rolling his shoulders to work out the kinks from hours of overhead work, I found myself asking if he wanted a beer, surprised by the casualness of my own voice. He accepted, and we sat on the floor amid the construction materials, our backs against the wall, sharing the kind of comfortable silence that I had forgotten could exist between two people. Somehow the conversation turned to regrets, the paths not taken that haunt the quiet hours of middle age. I found myself talking about dreams I had abandoned so gradually that I could barely remember having held them, about the person I had thought I might become before life had taught me to settle for the person I was capable of being. The words came more easily than they should have, loosened by the beer and the dim light, and the strange intimacy of sitting in a space that was being transformed under our shared attention. He listened without judgment, offering his own admissions of roads not traveled, opportunities missed through fear or indecision or simple bad timing. He spoke about the loneliness that came with constant movement, the way that avoiding commitment could become its own kind of trap, leaving you free but floating, unanchored to anything substantial enough to provide meaning. At some point, I made a comment about the absurdity of my daily routine, the way I had become a character in someone else's idea of what a successful life should look like, and something about the way I described it must have struck him as genuinely funny because he started laughing, not the polite chuckle that people offer to acknowledge attempted humor, but real laughter, the kind that comes from recognition of shared absurdity. The sound was infectious, and I found myself laughing too, really laughing for the first time in longer than I could remember. The laughter built on itself, fed by the release of tensions I hadn't realized I was carrying, until we were both doubled over like teenagers who had gotten away with something forbidden. The sound filled the room and seemed to change its fundamental character, making it feel less like a construction site and more like a space where transformation was not just possible, but inevitable. When the laughter finally subsided, we sat in a silence that felt entirely different from the one that had preceded it. Something had shifted in the space between us, Some barrier had been crossed without either of us making a conscious decision to cross it. I became aware that he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before, something that might have been recognition or invitation or simply curiosity about what might happen next. Our eyes met and held for longer than the moment required, long enough for me to notice the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, long enough for me to realize that something was happening that I was not prepared for, but did not want to stop. Time seemed to slow and thicken around us the way it had during that first brief contact weeks ago. But this time there was no pretense of accident, no excuse of professional necessity. I felt something stir in my chest that I recognized from dreams I had been having lately, dreams I woke from feeling both guilty and more alive than I had felt in years. But even as part of me wanted to lean forward, to discover what might happen if I closed the distance between us, another part of me was already calculating the cost of such a gesture, already imagining the ways that 5 minutes of honesty could unravel 20 years of carefully constructed life. The moment stretched until it became unbearable, and finally he looked away, reaching for his tool bag with movements that seemed slightly unsteady. He mentioned something about getting an early start tomorrow, about materials he needed to pick up before the hardware store closed, but his voice carried the same breathlessness I could feel in my own chest. I walked him to the door, our conversation returning to the safe territory of repair schedules and weather forecasts. But something had changed between us that could not be unchanged, some recognition that we were no longer simply homeowner and contractor, but two people who had discovered they were capable of affecting each other in ways that had nothing to do with ceiling repairs. After he left, I stood in the half-finished room for a long time, breathing the air that still seemed charged with possibility and danger. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake listening to the sounds of our quiet house, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and longing that I recognized as the feeling of being fully awake for the first time in years, terrible and wonderful in equal measure, like discovering that you had been holding your breath for decades and finally, accidentally, remembered how to breathe. The sleepless hours that followed stretched like a bridge between the person I had been that morning and someone I was only beginning to recognize. Clara returned from her client dinner near midnight, moving through our bedroom with the careful quiet of someone trying not to disturb a sleep I was not experiencing. I lay motionless beside her, listening to her settle into the familiar rhythms of our shared bed while my mind replayed every moment of the evening with Elias, searching for clues about what had actually happened between us and what it might mean. When the house finally fell into the deep silence that comes after midnight, I found myself unable to remain in bed any longer. I slipped from under the covers, padded barefoot through the dark hallway, and made my way to the half-repaired room where the smell of fresh plaster and sawdust still lingered like evidence of transformation interrupted mid-process. In the dim light filtering through the window, I could see the progress Elias had made, the careful reconstruction of what the storm had damaged. New drywall covered sections where water had eaten through the old plaster, seams taped and mud with the precision of someone who understood that repair work was as much about patience as skill. I ran my fingers along the smooth surface where his hands had worked just hours before, tracing the invisible boundaries between old damage and new possibility. The room felt different in the darkness, charged with the memory of laughter and lingering glances, with the recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the space between two people who had started as strangers and become something I didn't yet have words to describe. I sat on the floor where we had sat together, my back against the same wall, trying to understand what was happening to me. For weeks, I had been telling myself that my fascination with Elias was simple admiration, the natural appreciation one person feels for another who possesses skills and qualities they find impressive. I had convinced myself that my eagerness for his daily presence was nothing more than the relief of having meaningful conversation in a house that had grown too quiet, too careful, too empty of genuine human connection. But sitting alone in the darkness, surrounded by the evidence of his work and the lingering warmth of his presence, I could no longer maintain these careful self-deceptions. What I felt when I looked at him What stirred in my chest when his voice carried that particular note of quiet certainty? What awakened in my body during those moments of incidental contact was not admiration. It was desire. The recognition hit me with a force that left me breathless, as though I had been walking along what I thought was solid ground only to discover it was ice, thin and treacherous, ready to crack under the weight of acknowledgement. I desired him, not just his presence or his conversation or the comfort of his steady competence, but him, the physical reality of him, the weight and warmth and aliveness of another man's body in ways I had not allowed myself to want anything in longer than I could measure. With this admission came a memory I had buried so deeply I had convinced myself it belonged to someone else, a younger version of myself I had outgrown through the simple passage of time and the accumulation of more acceptable experiences. I was 21, a senior in college, struggling through finals week in the library that stayed open all night during exam period. Another student, someone from my American literature class whose name was David or Daniel, something that started with D, had been studying at the table across from mine for hours. We had acknowledged each other with the weary solidarity of people pulling an all-nighter for the same professor, sharing eye rolls when someone's phone buzzed too loudly, offering silent sympathy when one of us dropped a pen or knocked over coffee. Around 3 a.m, when the library had emptied except for the most desperate cases, he had asked if I wanted to take a break, get some air, walk around the quad to clear our heads. The conversation during that walk had been easy, comfortable, the kind of connection that sometimes emerges between strangers when circumstances strip away the usual social pretenses. We talked about the books we were reading, the papers we were dreading, the uncertain futures waiting beyond graduation. But underneath the surface conversation, something else was happening, some current of attraction that neither of us acknowledged directly, but both of us felt. When we ended up back at his dorm room, ostensibly to continue studying, but really because neither of us wanted the connection to end, I told myself I was simply extending an interesting conversation. When we sat closer together on his narrow single bed than two people strictly needed to sit while looking at textbooks, I convinced myself it was just practical use of limited space. When our shoulders touched and neither of us moved away, I decided it meant nothing more than comfortable familiarity. But when he turned to point out a passage in the book we were sharing and found my face inches from his, when our eyes met and held in a moment that stretched beyond any reasonable explanation, when he leaned forward and kissed me with a gentleness that felt like recognition of something I hadn't known I was waiting for, I could no longer pretend I didn't understand what was happening. That kiss lasted perhaps 30 seconds before the weight of implication crashed down on both of us, before we pulled apart and spent the remaining hours until dawn talking frantically about anything except what had just occurred. But those 30 seconds had revealed something about myself that I spent the next 20 years trying to forget, some essential truth about desire and possibility that didn't fit into the life I was already planning to build. I never saw him again after that semester ended, never pursued what that moment might have led to, never allowed myself to consider that it represented anything more than confusion born of stress and exhaustion and too much caffeine. I graduated, started dating Clara seriously, moved into the predictable trajectory of career and marriage and family that seemed to offer protection from the kind of uncertainty that late-night kiss had represented. But the memory of it never entirely disappeared. It lived in my body like a dormant seed, waiting for the right conditions to germinate, for someone like Elias to water it with attention and care and the kind of presence that made concealment feel more exhausting than honesty. Now, sitting in our half-repaired room, I understood that what I had felt with that long-forgotten classmate was the same thing I felt when Elias looked at me with those brown eyes flecked with gold, when his hand touched my shoulder, when he laughed at something I said with genuine pleasure rather than polite acknowledgement. The truth had been living in my body all along, patient and persistent as the water that had found its way through our ceiling, waiting for the right pressure, the right moment of weakness in my defenses to reveal itself. I was a man who desired other men, who had always desired other men, who had constructed an entire life around the elaborate performance of being someone else because the alternative had seemed too dangerous to contemplate. When morning came, I moved through my usual routine with the mechanical precision of someone operating on autopilot while his real attention focused elsewhere. I made coffee I didn't drink, exchanged morning pleasantries with Clara that felt like lines from a play I no longer remembered auditioning for, drove Marissa to school while she remained lost in whatever private world her earbuds provided access to. But when I returned home to find Elias already at work, setting up his tools for another day of repair, I discovered that everything had changed in ways I could not hide. When he looked up from his materials and smiled that easy smile I had grown to anticipate, I felt something shift in my face. Some mask I had been wearing slip just enough to reveal what lay beneath. He noticed immediately. I could see it in the way his expression changed, became more careful, more attentive, as though he were trying to read a text that had been partially obscured. We spoke about the day's work, about materials and timelines, but underneath the practical conversation ran a current of recognition that had not been there before, an acknowledgement of something neither of us was quite ready to name. When he asked me to hold one end of a measuring tape while he marked a cutting line, our hands touched as he passed me the metal case, and this time neither of us pulled away. The contact lasted longer than necessity required, long enough for me to feel the calluses on his palm, long enough for him to run his thumb across my knuckles in a gesture so brief it might have been accidental if not for the way his eyes met mine when it happened. I felt terrified and free in equal measure, as though I were standing at the edge of a cliff I had been approaching my entire life without realizing it, finally close enough to see what lay on the other side of the careful boundaries I had constructed around my heart. The truth that had been waiting in my body for decades was finally demanding acknowledgement, and I no longer possessed the strength to keep it buried beneath the weight of respectability and fear. That morning, holding Elias's gaze while his thumb traced across my skin, I understood that some transformations begin not with dramatic declarations, but with the simple courage to stop pretending you are someone other than who you have always been. The ceiling above us was nearly repaired, stronger now than it had been before the storm revealed its hidden weaknesses. But the real reconstruction was happening in the space between two men who had found each other in the midst of fixing something broken, and I was no longer certain which of us was the one in need of repair. Clara had always possessed an intuitive awareness of emotional weather systems, the ability to sense shifts in atmospheric pressure that preceded storms others couldn't see coming. Over the years of our marriage, I had learned to trust her radar for changes in family dynamics, workplace tensions, the subtle indicators that suggested someone in our orbit was struggling with something they hadn't yet found words to express. But I had grown careless about concealing the changes happening within myself, too distracted by the intensity of my internal revolution to maintain the careful performance that had protected us both from uncomfortable truths for so long. She noticed first that I had stopped reaching for her in bed, my body no longer seeking the familiar comfort of her warmth during the unconscious hours when defenses typically lowered. Where once I had moved toward her in sleep, now I found myself curled against the far edge of the mattress, as though some part of me understood that physical intimacy would feel like deception, a betrayal of the honesty I was finally learning to practice with myself. During dinner conversations, she began to catch me staring into space with expressions she couldn't decipher, my attention drifting away from discussions of Marissa's college applications or her latest work project to some internal landscape that seemed to absorb me completely. When she asked what I was thinking about, I would offer vague responses about work stress or home repairs, answers that satisfied the immediate requirement for explanation while revealing nothing about the actual geography of my thoughts. But it was my reaction to her physical affection that finally convinced her something fundamental had shifted. When she touched my shoulder while passing behind my chair, when she kissed my cheek before leaving for work, when she reached for my hand during a movie we were watching together, she began to notice the slight stiffening in my body, the way I seemed to tolerate rather than welcome her touch. Not rejection, exactly, but a distance that felt new and troubling, as though I had become a stranger wearing a mask of her husband's face. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening in late November, nearly 2 weeks after my sleepless night of recognition. Elias had finished the major repair work days earlier, leaving behind a ceiling that looked better than it had in years. But he continued to return for small touch-up tasks, final coats of paint, minor adjustments that seemed designed to extend our shared time rather than serve any practical necessity. I had not questioned these additional visits, too grateful for the continued presence of someone who seemed to understand the person I was discovering myself to be. Clara waited until Marissa had retreated to her room for the evening, until the house had settled into the quiet routines that marked the end of another carefully managed day. We were sitting in the living room, she with her laptop, me pretending to read a book while actually replaying my conversation with Elias from earlier that afternoon. The silence between us had grown comfortable in the way that long marriages sometimes accommodate, but tonight it felt charged with unspoken questions. She closed her laptop and set it aside with the deliberate movements of someone who had been rehearsing this moment. When she looked at me, her expression carried none of the casual affection that typically characterized our evening interactions, but something more serious, more focused, as though she were trying to see through layers of protection I hadn't realized I was wearing. "Is there someone else?" she asked, her voice steady but not casual, carrying the weight of someone who had been considering this possibility for longer than I had imagined. The question hung in the air between us like smoke, visible and substantive, demanding acknowledgement. I opened my mouth to offer the denial that 20 years of marriage training had prepared me to give, but found myself unable to produce the words. Something about the directness of her question, the way it cut through all the careful circumlocution I had been using to avoid this exact moment, made deception feel impossible. I sat there in silence, watching her face change as my inability to answer became answer enough. The confrontation that followed possessed the terrible intimacy of surgery performed without anesthesia, necessary and devastating in equal measure. She did not raise her voice, did not throw objects or make dramatic accusations, but spoke with the quiet precision of someone who had been preparing for this conversation longer than either of us had acknowledged. She had felt my withdrawal, she said, had noticed the way I seemed to be living inside our marriage while simultaneously absent from it, going through the motions of partnership while my real attention focused elsewhere. But what hurt most, she continued, was not the possibility that I might be attracted to someone else, but the growing realization that the man she had been married to for 20 years had never been entirely present, had always been holding back some essential part of himself that she was only now understanding had never belonged to her. She spoke about feeling like she had been living with a performance rather than a person, raising a daughter with someone who had been acting the part of husband and father while his authentic self remained carefully hidden from view. I tried to explain, stumbling over words that felt inadequate to describe the complexity of what I was experiencing. I spoke about parts of myself I had buried so deeply I had forgotten they existed, about desires I had been taught to see as shameful long before I understood what they might mean, about the way that building a life on the foundation of who I thought I should be rather than who I actually was had created a structure that felt increasingly impossible to inhabit. She listened with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a language she had never heard before, asking questions that revealed how completely I had succeeded in concealing my struggle, how thoroughly I had managed to hide the fact that our entire marriage had been built on the elaborate performance of being someone I was not. When I finally admitted that yes, there was someone else, but that it wasn't what she might think, that it was more complicated than simple infidelity, she asked the question I had been dreading. "Is it a man?" she said, not accusingly, but with the weary recognition of someone who had finally identified the missing piece of a puzzle she had been trying to solve for years. Again, I found myself unable to speak, my silence confirming what some part of her had always known but never allowed herself to fully acknowledge. What followed was not anger, but something more devastating: grief. She wept not from betrayal alone, but from the recognition of all the years they had both lost to my inability to be honest about who I was. all the intimacy that had been sacrificed to maintain a lie I had told so convincingly that even I had almost believed it. She grieved for the authentic connection we might have had if I had possessed the courage to acknowledge my truth earlier, and for the woman she had been, loving someone who could never love her back in the way she deserved to be loved. The next morning, Elias arrived for what we both knew would be his final visit, the last small adjustments that would officially complete the repair work that had brought us together. He took one look at my face and understood that something fundamental had changed, that the careful equilibrium we had maintained for weeks was no longer sustainable. We worked in silence for most of the morning, but when he was packing his tools for the last time, he paused and looked at me with an expression of such gentle understanding that I felt something break open in my chest. "You have to decide who you want to be when the ceiling finally gives way," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the pressure or urgency I might have expected, but something deeper, more patient, like someone who understood that the most important choices could not be rushed. He was not asking me to choose him, I realized, but to choose myself, to find the courage to inhabit my own life honestly regardless of what that might mean for either of us. Standing in that repaired room, watching him gather his tools and prepare to leave, I understood that I was facing the most fundamental choice of my adult life. I could return to the safety of the careful construction I had built around myself, continue to live inside the marriage and family and identity that felt increasingly like a costume I could not remove. Or I could step into the terrifying uncertainty of truth, acknowledge who I had always been, and face whatever consequences that acknowledgement might bring. The ceiling above us was stronger now than it had been before the storm, its hidden weaknesses exposed and reinforced, its surface smooth and unmarked by the damage that had once threatened to bring it down. But I knew that some repairs changed the fundamental character of what they fixed, made it impossible to return to the way things had been before the need for reconstruction became undeniable. As Elias walked toward the door, I felt the weight of possibility and terror in equal measure, knowing that whatever I decided in the hours that followed would determine not just what happened between us, but who I would allow myself to become in whatever time remained of my one irreplaceable life. The house had never been quieter than it was that Friday evening, when Clara's car pulled out of our driveway with Marissa in the passenger seat, both of them heading to Clara's mother's house for what she had described as a necessary weekend away. The sound of the engine fading into the distance seemed to take with it the last remnants of the careful performance we had all been maintaining, leaving behind only the essential silence of a space finally allowed to exist without pretense. I stood at the living room window, watching the taillights disappear around the corner, feeling something I had not experienced in years, the profound stillness that comes when you are truly alone, when no one is watching you be anyone other than who you actually are. The sensation was both liberating and terrifying, like stepping out of clothes that had grown too tight, but discovering that underneath you were more vulnerable than you had remembered being. The house around me felt different without the ambient presence of family, without the low-level awareness of other people's needs and expectations that had shaped my movements through these rooms for so long. I walked through the hallway where photographs of our life together still hung on the walls, past Marissa's bedroom door with its carefully curated display of achievements and interests, into the kitchen where Clara's coffee mug still sat beside the sink, evidence of the morning routine that had carried us through another day of careful politeness. But it was the half-repaired room that drew me, the space where everything had changed and where nothing would ever be quite the same again. Elias had finished his work 3 days ago, leaving behind a ceiling that looked better than new, its surface smooth and unmarked by the damage that had once threatened everything we had built beneath it. The room smelled of fresh paint and possibility, of problems solved and structures reinforced, but also of something else, something that lingered in the air like the memory of meaningful conversation. I had been avoiding this room since our confrontation, unable to face the evidence of transformation that it represented, but now I found myself drawn to it with the inevitability of someone who had been postponing a necessary reckoning. In the dim light of early evening, I could see the precision of Elias's work, The careful attention to detail that had restored not just the structural integrity of our ceiling, but something more fundamental, some faith in the possibility that broken things could be made whole again. On the small table where we had shared tools and coffee and conversations that changed everything, two objects sat side by side, like opposing arguments in a debate I had been having with myself for weeks. My wedding ring, which I had removed that morning after Clara and Marissa left, lay next to the business card Elias had given me on his first day, the one I had carried in my wallet but never quite found the courage to use. The ring caught what light remained in the room. 20 years of marriage compressed into a circle of gold that had once felt like a promise, but now seemed more like evidence of good intentions that had never quite aligned with deeper truths. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the day I had first put it on and the certainty I had felt then about the life I was choosing to build. But that certainty belonged to someone I was no longer sure I had ever really been. Someone who had believed that wanting something enough would make it real, that commitment and good intentions could overcome the fundamental incompatibility between who I was and who I had tried to become. The ring represented safety, predictability, the comfort of known routines and shared history, but it also represented the exhausting weight of pretending to be someone I was not. The business card lay beside it like a question I was not yet ready to answer, printed with Elias's name and phone number in simple black letters that somehow contained the possibility of an entirely different future. Not necessarily a future with him, though that remained a hope I could no longer deny, but a future lived honestly, without the careful concealment that had defined my adult life for so long. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, holding the ring in one hand while looking at the card, weighing 20 years of carefully constructed life against the terrifying possibility of truth. The choice felt both momentous and simple, like standing at a crossroads where one path led back to familiar territory and the other disappeared into uncertainty that might hold either devastation or redemption. Finally, I set the ring down beside the card and walked to the window that faced our backyard, the one Elias had opened during his lunch breaks to let in fresh air while the paint dried. The window stuck slightly, swollen from humidity and years of neglect, but when I pushed against it, it gave way with a sound like an exhale, opening onto the night air that carried the scent of approaching winter and change. I stood there breathing in air that felt different from any I had inhaled in years, cold and sharp and unfiltered by the careful climate control that had regulated every aspect of our domestic existence. The sensation was almost shocking, like discovering I had been holding my breath for decades and finally, accidentally, remembered how to fill my lungs completely. Above me, the ceiling held its repaired position, strong and smooth and unmarked by the damage that had once threatened to bring it down. But I understood now that some repairs are temporary, that the forces that create cracks in the first place never entirely disappear, that the best you can hope for is to acknowledge the weakness and reinforce it as honestly as possible before the next storm tests your defenses. The truth about myself had been like that water, patient and persistent, finding every small weakness in the structure I had built around my heart, until finally the pressure became too great to contain. The storm that had damaged our ceiling had also created the conditions that allowed that truth to finally emerge, and now that it was exposed to air and light, I could no longer imagine trying to seal it back behind walls of careful pretense. I stood at that open window feeling both emptied and filled, unburdened of secrets that had grown heavier with each year of carrying them, but also weighted with the responsibility of deciding what to do with the freedom that honesty had created. I did not reach for the business card, not yet, did not make any calls or promises or dramatic declarations about the future I wanted to build. Instead, I simply stood there in the quiet of my temporarily empty house, allowing myself to feel the full weight and possibility of my own truth for the first time in 20 years. The air moved through me freely, carrying away the staleness of concealment and bringing in something I could only describe as hope, terrible and wonderful and alive with the promise that some transformations begin not with grand gestures, but with the simple courage to stop hiding from yourself. Outside, the night deepened around our neighborhood of careful houses and managed lives. But inside our half-repaired room, I finally allowed myself to breathe like someone who had nothing left to conceal, someone ready to discover what kind of life might be possible when you finally admit who you have always been.